5 minutes. That was all it took for everything to end. September 11th, 2025, began like any other working day. The sky above the city was clear. The streets moved with their usual rhythm. Inside the studio, lights were adjusted, cameras powered down, and schedules were checked for the next shoot. Nothing in the air suggested that this date would soon be remembered as a fracture point in modern entertainment history. Yu Menglong was expected to leave the studio shortly before 6 in the evening. For months, his routine had been predictable. Security teams had rehearsed it countless times. His movements were calculated, his exits timed, his protection carefully layered. To the outside world, he was a rising star whose life appeared effortless. Fame, success, admiration. But beneath that surface, something had shifted. In the days leading up to that evening, those close to Yu Meng noticed subtle changes. He spoke less freely. He watched people longer than necessary. He asked questions that made others uncomfortable. According to staff members, he had begun to keep notes, names, times, details that seemed irrelevant until they were not. When asked, he brushed it off. Curiosity, he said. Professional awareness. At 5:55 p.m., Yu Meng exited the studio. Surveillance cameras captured him stepping into the corridor, phone in hand, expression neutral. There was no visible panic, no sign of alarm, just a man following a familiar path, unaware that something fundamental had already gone wrong. At 6 p.m., his bodyguard should have been beside him. He was not. The man responsible for Yu Menglong's safety was not inexperienced. He was not careless. He had trained for years in elite protection units. He had guarded high-profile figures without incident. His record was clean, trusted, reliable, and yet on this day he was delayed. 5 minutes. At 6:02 p.m., witnesses later reported seeing a figure near the studio exit. The descriptions were vague. Dark clothing, hood pulled low, silent. Observers could not agree on details, but they agreed on one thing. The figure did not belong there. At 6:05 p.m., the bodyguard arrived. By then it was too late. Those 5 minutes, barely noticeable in daily life, would soon become the most analyzed interval in the story. Investigators, journalists, and millions of fans would attempt to reconstruct every second. Traffic patterns, phone calls, elevator delays, missed signals. Each element appeared minor on its own. Together, they formed a sequence that felt disturbingly precise. The question was no longer whether 5 minutes could change everything. That was already proven. The real question was why those 5 minutes existed at all. Because in a world where power, money, and silence often move faster than truth, delays are rarely accidental. And when timing aligns too perfectly, fate begins to look less like coincidence and more like design. What happened in those missing minutes did not just end a life. It opened a shadowed corridor of unanswered questions that would soon draw the attention of the entire world. And once opened, that corridor would not easily be closed. Reconstructing the final timeline became an obsession almost immediately. Investigators, analysts, and independent observers all began with the same assumption. If the tragedy was truly an accident, the sequence of events would reveal disorder, randomness, and human error. What emerged instead was something far more unsettling. At 5:55 p.m., Yu Menglong exited the studio through a side corridor, routinely reserved for controlled departures. Security cameras recorded him moving at a steady pace. His posture was upright. His expression revealed no urgency. To anyone watching in real time, it was an unremarkable moment, one of hundreds captured daily in a building designed for constant surveillance. At precisely 6 p.m., the protective formation should have closed around him. It did not. The bodyguard assigned to Yu Meng that evening was delayed by what was later described as a convergence of minor disruptions. A traffic slowdown near a single intersection, a call from security coordination that required confirmation, an elevator that did not arrive on schedule. None of these elements, on their own, would raise concern. In protective services, delays are measured in seconds, not minutes, and contingency plans exist to absorb small deviations. But this delay did not dissipate. It accumulated. Security protocols dictate that if a primary protector is absent, secondary coverage activates immediately. That did not occur. Records later showed inconsistencies in the handoff procedures. Some logs were incomplete. Others contradicted one another. When questioned, personnel offered explanations that sounded reasonable, but never aligned fully. At 6:02 p.m., witnesses reported noticing a figure near the studio exit. The descriptions varied, but certain elements repeated with disturbing consistency. Dark clothing, a hood or cap obscuring the face, no visible device, no hurried movement. The figure appeared to be waiting. What made these accounts significant was not their detail, but their timing. Security footage from adjacent corridors failed to capture the individual clearly. Cameras that should have covered the area showed brief interruptions. Frames skipped. Angles shifted slightly off-center. Later analysis suggested technical malfunctions, but experts noted that simultaneous failure across multiple viewpoints was statistically improbable without interference. At 6:05 p.m., the bodyguard arrived. The interval between his expected arrival and his actual presence lasted exactly 5 minutes. In personal protection, 5 minutes is not a delay. It is an exposure window. It is enough time for surveillance to confirm a target's vulnerability. Enough time for positioning. Enough time for execution. Security analysts would later emphasize that no competent attacker relies on chance. They rely on absence. The bodyguard's account of those minutes added another layer of complexity. He described receiving a phone call shortly before arriving at the studio. The caller did not identify themselves. The voice was calm, almost casual. According to his testimony, the message was brief. "You will be late." At the time, he dismissed it as a provocation, a prank, a coincidence. In hindsight, the call appeared to align too neatly with the outcome to be ignored. When he finally reached the exit corridor, the environment had changed. Witnesses described a sudden tension, raised voices, movement that was no longer routine. By the time the bodyguard took his position, whatever had unfolded in those missing minutes had already concluded. The figure seen earlier was gone. No verified footage captured their departure. As investigators began assembling a comprehensive timeline, they encountered resistance that was subtle but persistent. Requests for data were delayed. Certain recordings were reported missing. Staff members declined to provide on-record statements. When asked why, several cited instructions from higher management. Others referenced concerns about personal safety. The more the timeline solidified, the less accidental it appeared. The 5-minute gap was not empty. It was structured, every contributing factor, aligned within a margin that suggested coordination rather than chance. Traffic slowed at a specific intersection. A call arrived at a precise moment. Secondary security protocols failed, without triggering alarms. Surveillance coverage degraded exactly where it mattered most. Experts reviewing the case noted that orchestrated delays often mimic randomness. The goal is not to halt protection entirely, but to weaken it just enough, to create a window that appears coincidental until it is examined closely. As public attention intensified, independent analysts began to model alternative scenarios. In simulations where the bodyguard arrived on time, outcomes shifted dramatically. In several models, Yu Menglong would have remained under continuous protection. In others, the presence of the bodyguard altered the behavior of unidentified individuals in the area, causing them to withdraw. The conclusion was unavoidable. If the bodyguard had arrived 5 minutes earlier, the trajectory of that evening would have changed. If he had arrived 5 minutes later, the outcome might have been identical. The precision of the timing suggested intention, and intention implies planning. The question investigators now faced was no longer whether the 5-minute delay mattered. It was who benefited from it, who had knowledge of Yu Menglong's movements, who understood the security structure well enough to exploit its weakest moment. Because delays of this nature do not simply happen. They are created, and somewhere within those missing minutes, someone made sure that protection arrived just late enough to be useless. If the delay was engineered, then the person who engineered it understood the system from the inside. When attention shifted from the missing minutes to the man responsible for preventing them, the narrative became far more complicated. The bodyguard was not an unknown figure, suddenly thrust into a crisis. He had been carefully selected, vetted, trusted. His presence was meant to neutralize uncertainty, not create it. On paper, his credentials were exemplary. He had trained with elite protection units, specializing in close-quarter security and threat anticipation. His career included assignments protecting high-profile entertainers, executives, and political figures. There were no recorded incidents of failure, no disciplinary actions, no public controversies. To his colleagues, he was methodical, restrained, and reliable. That reputation made the delay difficult to accept. In his first public statement, the bodyguard described the incident as a convergence of unfortunate circumstances. Traffic congestion, a miscommunication, a delay that escalated faster than expected. His voice during the interview was controlled but strained. When he repeated the phrase 5 minutes, it carried weight far beyond its numerical value. Yet as investigators began examining his background more closely, inconsistencies emerged. Financial records revealed unexplained debts accumulated in the months preceding the incident. The amounts were significant, but not catastrophic. Enough to create pressure, enough to make someone vulnerable. When asked about them, the bodyguard cited personal obligations and denied any external influence. However, several transactions lacked clear documentation. Former colleagues were interviewed next. Most defended him, emphasizing his professionalism and discipline. But a smaller group spoke cautiously, choosing their words with care. One described him as carrying weight that never fully surfaced. Another mentioned that certain past assignments ended abruptly, with clients requesting replacements without formal complaints. Those details alone did not imply wrongdoing. In private security, discretion often obscures context. But combined with the timing of the delay, they demanded closer scrutiny. The most troubling element emerged from phone records. In the days leading up to Yu Menglong's death, the bodyguard received multiple calls from numbers that could not be traced through standard databases. Several occurred late at night. Others clustered around key moments in his schedule. One call, placed minutes before the incident, lasted less than 20 seconds. According to the bodyguard, the caller's voice was unfamiliar, calm, unhurried. "You will be late." At the time, he interpreted it as harassment. Security professionals are accustomed to intimidation attempts. Most are dismissed. But this call, he later admitted, unsettled him. Not because of its threat, but because of its certainty. After the incident, the psychological toll became visible. The bodyguard reported severe sleep disruption, recurrent intrusive memories, fixation on alternative outcomes. He described replaying the final moments repeatedly, altering small decisions in his mind. A different route, a missed call ignored, a step taken faster. Mental health experts noted that such symptoms were consistent with acute trauma. They also warned that trauma could distort recall, complicating testimony. Public reaction was divided. Some viewed him as another casualty of the tragedy, a professional destroyed by circumstances beyond his control. Others were less forgiving. Online forums accused him of negligence. Some suggested complicity. Others claimed he had been coerced or blackmailed into arriving late. The lack of clear answers allowed suspicion to multiply. Investigators examined whether the delay could have been externally manipulated. Security systems rely on predictability. Routes, schedules, and contingency responses are often known to a limited circle. If someone wanted to engineer a delay, they would need knowledge of these patterns. They would also need leverage, financial pressure, threats, or access to communication channels trusted by the bodyguard. One former security consultant reviewing the case noted that the delay did not resemble panic or confusion. It resembled hesitation, a momentary pause at a critical juncture, the kind of pause that occurs when a decision is weighed under pressure. Was the bodyguard merely late, or was he made late? That question became central to the investigation. As scrutiny intensified, the bodyguard revealed another detail he had initially withheld. In the weeks before the incident, he had been warned indirectly about Yu Menglong. Not about a specific threat, but about attention. People are watching, he had been told. Timing matters. At the time, he interpreted the message as vague industry chatter. In retrospect, it aligned too closely with what followed. Records showed that on the day of the tragedy, certain security protocols were modified without clear authorization. Secondary coverage assignments were altered. Communication logs were incomplete. When questioned, supervisors cited routine adjustments. No one accepted responsibility for the changes. The pattern suggested fragmentation, not chaos but selective absence. Security experts emphasized that protective systems fail most often not through force, but through misdirection. A call that diverts attention, a minor change that cascades, a delay introduced at exactly the wrong moment. The bodyguard, whether knowingly or not, became the focal point of that failure. As public pressure mounted, he faced a reality that extended beyond professional accountability. His identity had shifted. He was no longer simply a protector who arrived too late. He was a potential variable in a much larger equation. And if the delay had been orchestrated, then his role was either instrumental or expendable. Both possibilities carried disturbing implications. Because in operations designed to eliminate risk, those closest to the target are often not meant to survive scrutiny. They are meant to absorb blame, to carry guilt, to distract from the structure that allowed the plan to succeed. The investigation now faced a darker possibility. If the bodyguard was manipulated, then someone anticipated not only Yu Menglong's movements, but the emotional and psychological response of the man assigned to protect him, which meant the delay was not simply a failure. It was a calculated fracture. If the bodyguard was only a tool, then the true decision-maker had not yet been named. The investigation took a decisive turn when attention shifted away from the delay itself and toward its potential motive. Timing alone could explain how the tragedy occurred. It could not explain why. To understand that, investigators began examining what Yu Menglong had been doing in the weeks before his death. What emerged was a portrait starkly different from the public image. Behind the controlled interviews and polished appearances, Yu Meng had been unsettled. Message recovered from his phone revealed a growing unease. He described feeling watched, followed, evaluated. In one exchange with a close friend, he wrote that certain conversations no longer felt accidental. People asked questions that carried subtext. Meetings ended abruptly. Faces hardened when he pressed for clarity. He had begun to document what he noticed. A small notebook was later discovered among his personal belongings. Inside were handwritten names, dates, and locations. Some entries referenced contracts. Others alluded to meetings that did not appear on any official schedule. Several notes were marked with question marks. One phrase appeared more than once. Timing matters. Staff members at the studio would later confirm that Yu Meng had been asking unusual questions in the days before the incident. He requested access to documents outside his immediate scope. He asked about ownership structures, about financial arrangements that were typically handled several layers above him. One assistant recalled him reviewing printed pages in silence, his expression tense. "I think he found something," the assistant said privately. Something he was not supposed to see. If Yu Meng had uncovered information that threatened powerful interests, his vulnerability would have increased dramatically. In industries built on silence and leverage, exposure is not merely inconvenient, it is dangerous. The disappearance of evidence following his death reinforced that suspicion. Despite extensive surveillance coverage inside and around the studio, footage of the critical moments was missing. Not corrupted, not delayed, gone. Requests to retrieve backups were met with procedural obstacles. Technicians reported that certain files had been accessed remotely shortly after the incident. No authorization records were produced. Witnesses began to withdraw. One staff member who initially agreed to speak later declined, citing concerns for personal safety. Another changed their account, removing references to specific individuals. A third reportedly left the city altogether. Investigators noted a pattern familiar from other high-profile cases. Silence enforced not through explicit threats, but through implication. Meanwhile, online communities intensified their efforts. Fans began cross-referencing Yu Meng's last known movements with sightings reported near the studio. Independent analysts mapped routes, timestamps, and social media activity. A recurring detail emerged. A shadowy figure appeared repeatedly near locations Yu Meng visited in his final days. Always distant, always unidentifiable. always present just long enough to be noticed. The figure became symbolic, not because of what was known, but because of what was missing. Security experts reviewing the case emphasized that such figures often serve as placeholders. They draw attention while shielding the structure behind them. A visible presence distracts from invisible coordination. Investigators then examined internal communications from the studio. Leaked emails suggested that senior personnel were aware of potential risks surrounding Yu Menglong. Discussions referenced managing exposure and minimizing disruption. Nowhere was there evidence of enhanced protection. Instead, instructions appeared to limit information flow. Staff were advised to follow protocol and avoid unnecessary engagement. One message stood out: do not escalate unless directed. The implication was clear. Decisions were being centralized, and someone was controlling the response. As the scope widened, analysts began considering whether Yu Menglong's death was part of a broader pattern. Reports surfaced of other performers receiving threats, of contracts renegotiated under pressure, of individuals who questioned terms finding themselves sidelined or isolated. None of these incidents were officially connected. Together, they suggested an environment where compliance was enforced quietly. Yu Menglong's case differed in one critical aspect. He did not comply. Friends recalled that he had discussed speaking publicly, not with accusations but with questions. Transparency, he said, was protection. The notebook, the messages, the meetings, all pointed toward a man preparing to confront something larger than himself. That preparation may have accelerated the timeline. If his movements were being monitored, then the 5-minute delay was not simply an opportunity. It was a trigger, a moment selected with precision to ensure maximum effect and minimum exposure. The delay neutralized protection without raising immediate alarms. The missing footage erased visual confirmation. The confusion fragmented accountability. By the time questions were asked, the structure that enabled the outcome was already obscured. What remained was absence, an absent protector, absent evidence, absent witnesses, and a narrative that framed the event as tragedy rather than intervention. As investigators reviewed the sequence in its entirety, a conclusion began to form. Not a definitive answer, but a working theory. If Yu Menglong had been targeted, then the delay was not the cause of his death. It was the condition required for it, which meant the true center of the case was not the man who arrived too late. It was the system that ensured he would. If the delay was a condition, not a mistake, then the decision to let Yu Menglong remain unprotected was made long before that evening. In the weeks following Yu Menglong's death, the world searched for resolution. Statements were issued, investigations were announced, committees were formed. Each promised clarity, yet none delivered certainty. What remained was a structure of unanswered questions held together by absence. 5 minutes became the focal point of every discussion, not because of their length, but because of their consequence. Analysts revisited them repeatedly, dissecting each second, each decision, each failure. The more those minutes were examined, the more they appeared less like an anomaly and more like a boundary, a line drawn between protection and exposure. Official inquiries emphasized procedure, human error, unfortunate timing. But those explanations struggled to account for what was missing. Footage that should have existed did not. Records that should have aligned contradicted one another. Witnesses who initially spoke withdrew into silence. Each disappearance narrowed the path toward truth. Yu Menglong's family refused to accept the narrative of coincidence. In their statements, they spoke not only of grief, but of disbelief. They described a man who had grown cautious, who sensed pressure closing in, who believed that knowledge carried risk. Their legal efforts focused on accountability, demanding transparency from institutions that had offered only reassurances. They were not asking who pulled a trigger. They were asking who allowed the moment to exist. Public reaction evolved into something larger. Fans across continents documented timelines, archived posts, preserved fragments of information before they could vanish. What began as mourning transformed into vigilance. Independent investigations flourished, where official ones stalled. The story ceased to belong to any single authority. It became collective. Security experts, speaking anonymously, warned that cases like this rarely end with revelation. Systems designed to protect influence are resilient. They absorb shock, redistribute blame, and wait for attention to fade. Time, they noted, is often the final barrier to accountability. Yet time was also the symbol of the crime. 5 minutes had been enough to alter a life, a family, and an industry's perception of itself. Enough to expose how fragile protection becomes when coordination fails. Enough to demonstrate how silence can be enforced without force. The bodyguard remained suspended between roles. To some, he was a tragic figure, haunted by delay. To others, a reminder that proximity to power does not guarantee agency. Whether manipulated or merely misled, his presence underscored a deeper truth. Systems do not rely on villains alone. They rely on pressure, on fear, on moments where hesitation is engineered. As investigations continued without resolution, a pattern emerged. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Every attempt to isolate the incident led back to the same realization. The delay was not the story. It was the symptom. What mattered was the decision that preceded it. Someone knew Yu Menglong would be vulnerable. Someone understood the structure protecting him well enough to create a gap. Someone benefited from his silence. Whether that decision was made in a boardroom, a private call, or an unrecorded conversation remains unknown. What is known is this: 5 minutes were enough to end a life, but they may not be enough to bury the truth.